Welcome to Sustainable Fairfield. Today I have Avi Pogel with me.
Hi.
He is a resident of Fairfield, and you grew up here,
I did.
and you went away for a little while, and then you came back. So
Absolutely.
what brought you back?
It's a great place to live, small town, lots of access to gardening space, and I'd started fruit trees back in 2012 and tended those for a number of years, and then I moved to California for 5 years, so coming back to tend fruit trees more and see how the community's developed.
Well, you're the local expert in grafting. Can you talk a little bit about what is tree grafting, fruit tree grafting?
So grafting is a form of plant propagation where you take the living tissue of one plant with certain characteristics and you combine that to another plant of certain characteristics. And so for fruit trees, the characteristics are a root structure, which you want to have drought tolerance, disease tolerance, well anchored into the soil, and then the top of the tree, the scion, is going to be a better than average fruit. So say a Jonafree apple onto an M7 rootstock. And so an N7 is cold hardy, fairly well anchored, resists fire blight. Jonafree apple is an improved version of a Jonathan apple that is more disease resistant. And then when you graft the two together, you can plant the tree, and it will grow the desired fruit for you. Does that kind of answer the
Well, yeah, because
question?
you want to have a hardy rootstock. And
Yep,
then,
exactly.
and then when you go to the store and you buy a fruit tree, you're buying a rootstock that's been already grafted with the specific fruit that
Right.
you want. And those are basically clones of other fruit trees that have that kind of fruit.
Yep. So
So like if you have a Jonathan or whatever, what is that a Jonathan? Is that I can't even think of an apple name.
Jonathan, yeah.
Okay, so you have a Jonathan, and you
right.
put it on, you graft it onto a hardy rootstock. That is your apple tree you bring home and you plant
Right.
in your backyard, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And the important thing is to contrast. If you just planted apple seeds, you will probably end up with a very bad tasting fruit in 5 to 10 years. Whereas when you graft a tree, the tissue that's being grafted, the scion wood, has already reached a certain level of maturity, so it will set fruit immediately. So you not only get fruit production sooner, you're also assured of the quality of fruit that you want. And planting fruit trees from seeds is just, you don't know what you're going to get. And when you're investing 10 or 15 years into a project, you kind of want to know what you're going to be getting right off the bat. And so grafting is really the only way to do that.
Right. So I think a lot of people don't really understand that about it. And you can graft more than one type of apple onto the same rootstock, right?
Right. So apples will tend to graft to other apples or other Malus genus species. So certain crab apples can be used for rootstock. Most of the rootstock that's available has been grown from cuttings in commercial nurseries because, again, if you had planted a apple seed, you're going to end up with a seedling rootstock, which is probably going to grow just to full size, but we don't know about its other characteristics. So they've taken cuttings from trees of known characteristics that they know how the size it's going to grow to generally. They know its disease resistance generally, and so then those are propagated also clonally. And what was the rest of the question? Why was I saying that?
You could put different varieties.
Oh, different varieties. And so, so for the apples, you can basically have the selected rootstock or a seedling rootstock or a crab apple and graft different varieties onto the same tree. Pears are a little bit more flexible because you can graft onto certain varieties of hawthorns, quinces, and wild sort of somewhat invasive seedling pears and commercially available pear rootstock. And then I guess what's interesting about that is that the pear will sometimes cross genuses, so that you can have a quince which will produce a fruit that's edible for cooking but not really for eating out of hand, and they're kind of bushy and a little bit thorny. whereas we want to eat a nice pear. Pears can get like 40 feet tall, 50 feet tall. And so when you graft a pear onto a quince, it'll keep that tree to about 7 to 10 feet tall. So you can, it's a way of dwarfing a pear. They won't live as long that way, but in a small space, you'd be able to have more fruit trees than you would if you just planted standard or generally grafted ones. And then the stone fruits is the one where it gets really interesting because you can graft almonds, plums, peaches, nectarines all onto the same tree. Cherries are also stone fruits, but those are less adaptable, so they'll just basically cherry onto cherry rootstock. But the plums are really where you can have, 17 different plums on a single tree because they'll all just play along.
That's great. Right, so we have a pretty hardy local peach here that grows pretty good from the stone.
Yes.
So you could grow that from the stone and then graft it later yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And those sometimes they're called Iowa peaches. I've heard them called Amish peaches. I think I've heard them called Indian peaches once, but they're a local peach. There's sort of a white flesh, and they're not an amazing fruit, but they grow well here. So if you want to have a reliable peach, then they're fantastic. So I really like them for that reason. And they do they have some complex flavor. They're just not like the big juicy, Western Colorado peach that would be really nice. And in terms of rootstock, I think that would make a really great rootstock. But that particular peach that you're talking about is interesting. It's kind of breaking some of the rules that we're talking about because it will come true to seed. So you could plant an Iowa peach seed and get an Iowa peach, which is kind of neat. But that wouldn't apply to everything else we were just talking about.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So a lot of people want to plant fruit trees, and they're like, "Yay! I planted a bunch of fruit trees." Okay, what do people need to know about planting fruit trees? It's not just as easy as plopping it in the ground and being done with it, right?
So the first thing would be site selection. You want to know what kind of soil you have, because that's going to determine largely what kind of rootstock you should be planting. So some rootstocks will do better in heavier clay soils than others, but if you're going to be planting in an urban environment in your backyard, most of you can still go to the the U.S. Geological Survey soil maps and look where your soil maps are. Just dig a small hole, see how much topsoil you have, see how much clay you have. If you know that your yard doesn't drain well, then you should consider bringing in some soil and actually planting a fruit tree on a mound. So site selection is important in knowing what you're getting into. And then protecting it from critters is a really big thing around here. So if you don't have a fenced yard, the deer are going to get in, and deer will kill a tree just right off the bat. They'll eat all the leaves when it's small, and they'll tear off branches, and a tree won't grow if it doesn't have leaves or branches. And then once the tree is tall enough, the bucks like to rub their antlers in the fall, specifically on smaller trees, and then they will just absolutely destroy a tree. So what you need to do is fence it, cage it. Rabbits in the winter will eat the bark off of trees, so it's really important to have a bark guard around maybe at least 2 feet, 3 feet up off the ground, so that the rabbits don't chew on the cambium and eat it. And then, but then a few years down the road, you need to make sure you take that bark guard off, because as the tree grows, the bark guard doesn't, and it can constrict the tree. So people have lost trees by forgetting to remove those, and so there's a lot that can go wrong when you're planting a fruit tree. But so it's important to water it really well when you first plant it, and then for the first couple of years, 2 to 3 years, if it's dry in the summer, water it regularly. The rule of thumb is things like 1 inch of rain a week, and then to do the calculations of what that would be, I don't know off the top of my head, but just a good soaking of the root zone once a week should be fine. don't go out and water it every day, because then you might end up with waterlogged soil, which is also going to be detrimental to the tree. So you want to water it thoroughly and then let it dry out to a certain extent, let the soil drain, and then water that again. And once the tree becomes established, you're not going to have to worry about. So, and that what that means is probably like 3 to 5 years down the road, you're not going to need to water it. But the droughts that we're having are becoming more severe. So I've seen drought stress on established trees, mature trees. So it's certainly in the middle of August, if it's been 100 degrees and hasn't rained in a month, then you should certainly go out and soak the root zone of your trees if you care about them and you want them to
and
thrive.
soaking it's like you turn your hose on real, like not too forceful. It's not like spray it. And
Right.
then you want to let it kind of drip in.
Ex-
And then another trick for finding how much clay you have is to dig your hole, pour water in there, and see how fast it drains.
Yep, exactly.
And if you pour it in there and it's still in there the next day, then you've got a lot of clay.
Then you have a lot of clay. And that's where you're going to want to basically build up the soil and plant a tree on that. So
And high mulching, too, can help break that down because the soil organisms can move up and down
Yeah.
in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, it's important to add a layer of mulch around the base of the tree. You don't want it to touch the trunk. So I would say about, oftentimes they're described as a donut. So you're going to want to basically make a donut of mulch that goes out about 3 feet. And that will prevent grass from growing, because grass is detrimental to trees. The grass roots and the tree roots live in the same zone. Grass is going to be more aggressive at taking the water that comes down, especially in lighter rain events. Plus, certain grasses can actually produce chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants. So you really want to remove the grass. And then there are kind of plastic mulch products that you could use, but and they work very effectively at preventing grass, but they don't allow for organic matter to get cycled into the soil by the mulch breaking down. So mulching at least twice a year is so in the spring and in the fall. And then, again, not touching the trunk, because then that can also cause problems with critters getting too close to the trunk or rot various things. So you want to leave about an inch or so away and then go out and have it be thickest, kind of like taper up into a mound on the outside that's maybe about 2.5, 3 inches, up to 4 inches thick. Kind of further away, and that area is also the root zone, so that's where most of the trees' feeder roots are growing. So it's where it's the most important to be preventing the grass from growing, as well as to maintain the moisture in the soil. And then as the organic matters from the wood chips are breaking down, hopefully with a lot of fungal activity, then those nutrients are being cycled in for the fruit tree.
Right. And then mulch, basically keeps the grass down. It also actually is really good when it's really dry.
Yep.
And it's also really good when it's really wet.
Yes.
Because it will soak up a lot of that extra water.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's great. So, okay, I have a fruit tree, and where is a place that I shouldn't plant it?
You shouldn't plant it too close to your house, but you also shouldn't plant it in between the sidewalk and the street.
I'm sorry, we're joking about that because we just found out that in Fairfield there's an ordinance you should not plant fruit trees in the right of way, which is the area between the sidewalk and the street.
Which is, there's reasons for that. It's unfortunate. I think we should have fruit trees everywhere.
But we're thinking of, there are fruit trees in the right of way right now.
Yeah.
What do we want to do about that? We haven't done anything about it yet, but what do we want to do?
We'd like to reach out to the homeowners who own those trees. We recognize that some people might be renting their houses, so they won't necessarily own them, but people whose trees interact with those trees on a daily basis because they're right outside their house, and see if they're harvesting the fruit, and if they're not, ask if they would like help have the fruit harvested, and then we were going to be donating that to Lord's Cupboard or the Golden Magnolia Soup Kitchen. And if people do want to keep their fruit,
or maybe someday having a cider party,
have a cider party, then just basically engaging with them about how they interact with that fruit tree and if they need help caring for it in some way. And one of the reasons why the fruit trees are not allowed on the city right away is because they can make a mess on the sidewalk. People can trip, and it attracts insects, and a lot of wasps in the fall are always eating on the fallen fruit, and possums and critters and general the things that live all around us, but we don't see all the time. And one way to prevent that mess is to actually eat the fruit. So being able to get it before it falls on the ground because it's overripe or it's still in good condition, and then use it, or teach the homeowner how to use that fruit. But we want people to enjoy this resource and recognize how good of a resource it is, and not just this like weird.
And that's one of the roles of pruning, right?
Right.
Is to keep the tree from getting too tall.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times people are like, well, what do you mean prune? How do I prune a fruit tree?
Pruning fruit trees is a bit of a craft, because you can't just start chopping off branches willy-nilly, because the goal of having a fruit tree is, of course, to harvest the fruit, but fruit buds only develop on wood of a certain age. So depending on the tree, apples, pears, for example, it's going to be on 2 to 3 year old wood. So if you start to cut off every bit of new growth that's always growing, you're never going to have new fruit developing. But if you never cut it either, then the wood that is producing fruit is going to get higher and higher off the ground. So the goal is to selectively cut out new growth and old growth in such a way that it will provide for called scaffolds of fruit producing buds that are going to be within harvesting range, but also that allows airflow into the tree, so that and light penetration, so that the fruit will ripen better, and it will also reduce the chance of pests and diseases, because sunlight and air tend to kill pests, whereas when you have a very crowded, dense, dark tree with no airflow, that's where molds and bacteria can be on the leaves and be on the fruit. So if you prune a tree, you're going to have better looking fruit.
And then sometimes there's too much fruit on that tree.
And yeah, exactly. So if there's too much fruit, then it can actually break the branches off the tree, and then in which case you don't get to control where that happens, and it might damage the structure of the tree. And also, the tree only has so much energy to produce towards fruit, and if it's dividing its energy into 500 pieces of fruit, each one's going to be a little bit smaller, maybe not as good flavor, whereas if you thin off 25%, maybe even 50% of that fruit, each individual piece of fruit is going to be better quality. And even though it's hard at the time to remove these, you think, oh, I'm going to get this fruit later. When it comes time to actually harvest it, it does make a big difference. And then you realize that, like, maybe I didn't need all of that fruit anyway. I'd rather have the better fruit. So thinning fruit is important. That is done, so thinning fruit can occur in multiple ways. One way to thin out is actually to be pruning off the branches that are going to be producing fruit. So once you start working with trees, you know what to look for, what the shape of the buds are that are going to be called fruit spurs or the flower buds, and you can cut those off. So you know that branch doesn't exist, it's not going to flower, it's not going to be fruit there. But you still want to leave plenty of fruit on the tree and not remove more than 25 or 30% of a tree's branches in any one season. But then in the spring, late spring, once the fruit has set, so that's when the flowers have been pollinated and they start to grow, you will wait until they're about maybe gumball size and go and then just kind of pluck them off. And there's a little bit of a technique to it. They don't want to come off, and if you pull too hard, you can pull off the whole fruit spur, tear the bark. So kind of like twisting on the stem until it comes off. You can go out with pruners, and probably you're not going to want to do them all in one day because you just will get tired. So go out and prune off a couple of handfuls from each branch if the tree looks overcrowded. Come back again the next week, and then as the season progresses and the fruit starts to grow, you'll get a better idea of which branches still have too much fruit and which don't. And you don't fatigue yourself trying to just remove little tiny pears or tiny apples, in one day.
Well, awesome. So you're using all your expertise, and you've been helping with the community orchard, and it's more than just fruit, right? You have nut trees in there as well.
Yeah, there's chestnuts, which are.
And where's this?
This is on the loop trail just to the east of Chautauqua Park. And it's on city land, so it's not part of the park, it's not part of the trail, it's owned by the city. And the history of that was in 2012, I believe, the city got a grant from Alliant Energy to plant trees for shade specifically, because it would be reducing the need for air conditioning in the summer. And you keep your house cooler, you don't need to spend energy to cool it. But the gentleman who was a sustainability coordinator at the time, Scott Tim, said, well, can we also use some of this money for fruit trees? And they said, sure. So we had about $2,500, and I had been doing a wholesale fruit tree sale each year for the previous couple of years that was started by the Sustainable Living Coalition. And when I moved back from Orcas Island, I took over the fruit tree sale. So we already had a relationship with Stark to get wholesale bare root fruit trees, and we used the money to buy those. And then on Earth Day, had about 200 volunteers come out and throughout the day and plant the fruit trees. And things have done pretty well overall. The city expanded the sewer, so we had to move some of those trees, and they're recovering. We've lost some trees due to certain fire blight is a big one that has killed some of the pears and apples, and the stone fruit, the peaches, apricots, plums weren't as hardy. They didn't last as long. So there's space to be planting more trees, which we hope to be doing, but the apples, the Asian pears, the aronia berries, and the chestnuts are thriving. So when you're on the trail, just walk through the orchard, see what's available to snack on.
So it's really there for people to go in and eat an apple off a tree, or a peach or a pear or whatever's ripe?
Yeah, absolutely. It's for the community to enjoy fresh fruit.
Right, but there's people keeping their eye on it, right? It's not like it's just down there growing on its own and no one's keeping track of what's going on, right?
There are a couple of us who go out there seasonally and will basically what the maintenance regime is weeding and mulching. That's primarily, and then pruning has been a part of that, but that is really only occurs in late winter, early spring, before the trees break dormancy, and it's something that one has to be familiar with. So don't just have anybody come with pruners.
Don't just go out there with pruners.
And start lopping the trees.
Well, what about just going out there and weeding? Where would you weed? Is there special plants you can't pull? Don't pull anything in the new pollinator garden.
Don't pull anything in the new pollinator garden. There's some comfrey, which is a broad-leafed, low-growing plant around some of the trees, which is there kind of as a living mulch. So it's not really a weed per se, and there's some perennial onions and perennial garlics that were planted, and those also can be beneficial for the trees because they can discourage critters from living in the mulch because they don't really like the smell of the garlic and the sulfur. And then apparently in the apple forests of Kazakhstan, there are understories of low-growing garlics and fruit trees, so we're kind of trying to mimic that environment. Mm-hmm. But other than that, and there's some goldenrod, which is a native prairie plant coming up around some of the trees, but the reed canary grass, the foxtail grasses, pokeweed, the poison parsnip, which be careful with when you're pulling poison parsnip because the sap can cause chemical burns.
If it's exposed to the sun.
If it's exposed to the sun.
Which you would be getting exposed to when you're outside.
So the photodermatitis, so if you are out in the summer and you're pulling up poison parsnip and you get the juice on your skin and then you look down and you'll have second-degree burns, third-degree burns from the chemicals. So be careful, wear gloves. Trying to think what other... There's some Queen Anne's lace, ragweed. So if you're a gardener and you know what a weed looks like, you know what ragweed looks like, you know that this is a fruit tree, this is mulch, this is a ragweed here, yeah, go ahead and pull that up. If there are any questions, you can contact us at fruityfairfield@gmail.com, as well as the Fairfield Community Orchard on Facebook. And so we're happy to have people reach out and ask us questions. And we've had some volunteer days, but if people would like to coordinate specifically, we can find more opportunities and potentially even have kind of nursery tutorials to let people know what's there so that they can go out on their own and monitor it. So it's not just a handful of us having to do it. It
That
really
would
does
be really
involve
that
the
would
whole
be really
community.
good. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it kind of belongs to everybody, but there's there's some rules about it. A couple.
Yeah.
I mean, not like they're not posted yet.
No.
We're thinking about putting some signs
Yeah.
up. But the idea of the commons is like a community-owned section of something, and like the commons in traditional Hispanic cultures. I was living in New Mexico for a long time. I lived in a town called Corrales, and it was called that because it was a lot of corrals.
Okay.
And what they did is they had their own private vegetable garden, but all of the areas that was a little bit more grassland that was away from the river was all considered the commons. And so everybody put their livestock there. So their goats and their sheep and their cows and their horses. And they were all kind of in this larger range of in not all standing in their own corrals. And that's like an example of the commons. We think of the commons as our roads are the commons. We share the roads. And one of the things is about any kind of commons, it's like, how do we share a community garden or a community orchard? And that's one of the things we're kind of talking about as a group. And we're looking for more people to come and help be part of that as well. And so would you say your contact information again?
Fruityfairfield@gmail.com.
Like fruity?
Like fruity, yes.
Fairfield.
Fairfield.
Nice.
And so when the fruit is ripe, hopefully there's going to be an abundance of it, so that there's going to be some for everybody. So if you go to the orchard, feel free to pick a couple, pick a grocery bags full, and fill your pockets, take it home, share it. Don't feel like you can only take one or two pieces, but it wouldn't be ideal to show up and pick every piece of fruit off of a tree.
Right.
So we want to leave some there, and there will be times where we'll have coordinated picking events specifically to donate to local food charities, but again, that would, as the coordinators of the orchard, we would be monitoring the trees, seeing which ones are ripe and they need to be picked, and we know that they're going to be going to an organization that's providing to a larger number of people. So if you have your own cider press and you want to go pick all of the apples out of the orchard for your own cider, that's not the purpose.
Or invite us to that cider party.
Yeah. Or invite people to the cider. Bring the cider press to the orchard.
Well, that's a great idea. We are looking for that.
Yeah.
It would be a real fun way to have a harvest party and make cider right on the spot. Wouldn't that be? I've done that. We used to do that in New Mexico, is have orchard parties.
Yeah,
and
that'd be fantastic.
have a big harvest fest. Very cool.
Yeah,
And so you were living in California before?
I was living in Berkeley, California for the past 5 years.
And you still wanted to come back to Fairfield?
Yes, absolutely.
You like it, the small town?
Yeah.
This?
Small town. This is not hustle and bustle. It's affordable. There's just, you can hear the crickets, and there's songbirds, and in the spring, the little frogs. What are they called?
Oh, I love those trilling frogs.
Yeah, we have little. The tree frogs are on our windows when we look outside. And my entire yard is just planted. It's a food forest, or an edible landscape. So there's some ornamentals for diversity, but the goal is that every plant is going to have some sort of culinary or medicinal purpose to it, and couldn't do that in a city.
That's
true.
true.
You can do that in a city. I was living in an apartment. I couldn't do that in the city.
Right.
I wanted to come back to where I had a house and some land, and and actually do that.
Right, and that's really the thing about Fairfield is that you can have a house and some land here.
Mm-hmm.
It's like everything is not totally built up and super uber expensive.
Yeah.
And there are other young people here too, besides just you, right? Yeah.
I've met a few other young people. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because that's one of the things we were talking about with Jennifer and with Solomon is like, what is it that youth really is looking for to either stay here and not like run off into the world and get lost, or what would bring people who are looking for an alternative to a big city? What would they find here, you think?
Yeah. So just off the top of my head, I'm not going to extrapolate with too many other people, because not everybody wants to have their own land and large garden, specifically what I wanted. So like the rest of the environment would have to be pretty bleak for me to not want to be here if I had my own garden. So like that was the primary driver. Generally, having some sort of jobs that that would provide for income. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure what.
No,
would,
that's true. You know, yeah. Well, and we
Yeah.
have very diverse restaurants here.
Yeah.
We have a lot of variety in our restaurants, and we have a lot of entertainment, like local entertainment here.
Right.
But yeah. And so, do you plan on staying a long time?
I do. Don't have any plans to leave.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
great. That's great. That's great. You want to have some kids here?
Yeah.
Good. We'll have to think of some fun things for them to do.
Yep. They'll be weeding, crawling around in the mulch.
Yeah, when my kids were little, they would go out to the garden and help me by basically eating all the fruit.
Yeah.
And I'd be, well, I didn't have to cook lunch on those
Right.
days.
Taste
Like,
test
I'm helping,
everything.
Mommy. I'm helping. But that's a really great way to that's a really great thing that Fairfield has, too. Is and one thing we were talking to Solomon is they're going to start showing movies at the
Oh, wow.
convention center, and he
Nice.
wants to start developing more community events. And
Yeah.
Jennifer was reminding us about the old singing and dance groups.
Oh, right. Yeah, there used
that-
to be a lot of contra dances and the swing dance. So that was very popular. So having more community events to engage people, I think, would go a long way. And
like local
attracting folks.
local
Yeah.
singers and local dancers. You know,
Yeah.
we were talking about how you can forget who you are and go ahead and just enjoy yourself.
Yeah.
And very simply and very inexpensively.
Absolutely.
Well, that seems like a good place to end. I thank you for coming and talking about Sustainable Fairfield.